We're beginning this Love Over Ego series today. And if I were to ask you as you sit here today what's more important, to love others or to let your ego run your actions, you'd be able to give a very clear answer. Of course we want to be loving. We want to make a difference rather than merely have others pander to our needs and desires. And yet we know it's not that simple. In practice, much of our life can feel like it revolves around us. It's similar with the world. We know that in the span of the universe, we're a bit of cosmic dust floating through space. But it really does look to us like the sun rises and sets around us. Ego is a lens through which we look at the world. And it distorts reality. It blinds us to what is. This is why the Lord, when he was on earth, said, "And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye and do not consider the plank in your own eye?" Our ego, that distorting perspective, is the plank. And he's saying, first get rid of that, and then you will see clearly to act lovingly. Don't have ego over love, have love over ego. The term that New Church teaching uses for ego is the proprium. Proprium literally means our self, but theologically it means our self that tries to run things apart from God. It is the self that sees us and our needs as the center of the universe. When a child is born, he or she is very self-centered, and we know that's okay. We know that we have to have that sense of self to get started. So we learn by saying, I look bad when I do that. It's time to stop. I get rewards when I do that. Let's cultivate that habit. And then, of course, there are good aspects of thinking about ourselves and being aware of ourselves. It's good to know what gives us pleasure and pain, what ways we feel called to serve other people. But it's not a very good ending place, because by itself it tends to insulate us to what gives others pleasure and pain, which is what spiritual living is about. So all war, all suffering, all pain comes when my needs are bigger than your needs, and I in some way impose my will on you and on the situation. In a reading from Divine Love and Wisdom, the Lord described that challenge. Can we feel the joy in another as our own joy? Or do we seek to impose our joy on others? New Church teaching is so clear that lasting happiness comes from being useful, from serving others. And when we do this, we put love over ego. So now we come to our story. The king of Judah, as with a host of kings before him, had been leading the people away from the worship of the Lord and even installing the worship of other gods in the temple in Jerusalem. They had reintroduced child sacrifice. They had done all kinds of terrible things. And because of this long history, persistent history of evil, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, conquered Judah, destroyed the temple, and brought many Jews back to Babylon. Now, Babylon's a perfect image for our ego. It calls to mind the Tower of Babel, a tower people build to ascend into heaven, a picture of what pride and ego is all about. Many of the other times Babel or Babylon is mentioned in its inner meaning, it describes a desire in us to control other people. Ego supremely desires to have its way, to control others. And it can be nice as long as you do what I want. But you don't, you're in trouble. So when we fall into selfish behaviors, as the children of Israel had been for quite some time, We become captive or controlled by pride and a desire to control. And that is manifested in Nebuchadnezzar's taking over. Nebuchadnezzar took the holy vessels from the temple to the land of Shinar, and he put them into the temple of his gods. And what this means is when we fall into selfish patterns, what we tend to do is corrupt the holy matters of the church with us. We manipulate what we know on a spiritual level for our own pleasure and purposes. Now, Nebuchadnezzar worshipped many gods. Ego in us tends to worship anything that gives us short-term pleasure. Each of our egos has an array of things that rise up in front of serving the Lord and others that become for a time the most important pleasure in our lives. So impatience, pride, social media, status, power, revenge. These can become our gods that we can worship when our ego takes over. And sometimes it'll show up just like self-absorption. Something that doesn't seem big and mean, but it's just focused on me. And the most insidious part of this, these desires try to carry away the good parts of us. Perhaps some of us have gotten so wrapped up in a selfish desire that we ended up breaking a spiritual law that we never, ever thought that we would break, or said something truly horrible, despicable to someone else. That's like the Jews being carried away to Babylon. Our selfish desires, when they're in control, try to pervert the good parts in us. So this is describing a pretty dark time, a time when ego has taken over. And the question is, well, what happens then? What's the path forward? Do we just implode and die, or is there another part that can take the high road? Enter Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So Nebuchadnezzar told the master of his eunuchs to find attractive, intelligent young men who could be trained to serve in the palace. So just following on with the theme, our ego, not content with holding sway in our lives, wants to corrupt all the bright and hopeful parts of ourselves and of those around us. So perhaps you've been around someone who is dirty-minded, and they can turn any comment that you make into a dirty joke. They're not content with just thinking it in themselves. They want to spread and infect the thinking of those around them. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, Babel in us tries to do. And we can see this in the naming process that went on for each of these young men. Each one is named for the Lord in some way, and now they're renamed for 3 different foreign gods. Daniel's name is God is my judge, and he's renamed Belteshazzar, which means either treasure of Baal or Baal will protect. Bel is Baal, that we meet so many times in the Old Testament. Hananiah means Jehovah has been gracious, and he's renamed Shadrach, which is inspiration of Aku. Mishael, belonging to God, is renamed Meshach, which is belonging to Aku. And then Azariah, Jehovah is my help, is renamed Abednego, who means servant or slave of Nego. So when our ego gets traction in our lives, it doesn't want competitors, and it turns our thinking away from the Lord to other pleasures, and it tries to corrupt the ways that we think about the Lord, to weaken that presence. Our name is our quality. It stands for who we are. So this renaming is a significant thing. These men entered into a 3-year training program, we might say a brainwashing program, to convert them into suitable servants or slaves of Nebuchadnezzar and his desires. And the tension in the rest of the story focuses on a surprisingly small item: what the young men eat. Nebuchadnezzar instructed that the king's delicacies and wine should be given to them. On the face of it, that looks like a very generous gesture. He's giving them the best food in the kingdom, the things that he would be eating himself. But likely, these were foods from feasts honoring the gods that he worshiped, which is something the Old Testament very specifically forbids. And it's a fair inference because we read in the story, but Daniel set his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine of his feast. It wouldn't be defiling himself to eat ordinary food. It was food dedicated to the service of a foreign god that would have been defiling himself. So that food stands for the delight in doing what is wrong. Swedenborg once wrote, "It has been granted to me to feel the quality of the delight of ruling from the love of self, and how great it is. It was such as to exceed all the delights that exist in the world. It was a delight possessing the whole mind, from its inmost parts to its outermost. In the body it was felt as something pleasant and agreeable, with a feeling of euphoria in the breast. It was also granted to me to perceive that from this delight, as from their fountainhead, there issued the delights of evil loves of all kinds, such as adulteries, revenge, fraud, slander, and evil-doing in general." So think of this food then that was being offered to them as standing for the toxic and alluring emotions that draw us into bad behavior, that offer us a poisonous delight to entice us. Daniel then, God is my judge, is trying to avoid being defiled. He wants to let the Lord's rules judge and decide how he acts, not these pleasures. And this attitude is the core to resistance of what Nebuchadnezzar stands for. Now notice, Daniel isn't leading a palace coup. He's just simply following the Lord. And this approach that Daniel takes reflects a very powerfully stated teaching about a kind of goodness that the Lord seeks to put in all of us. This goodness, we read, never fights, no matter how much it is assailed, because it is gentle and mild, long-suffering and yielding, for its nature is that of love and mercy. But although it does not fight, it nevertheless conquers all. It does not even think of combat, nor does it glory in victory. It is of this nature because it is divine and is of itself immune from harm, for no evil can assail good. Indeed, it cannot even remain in the sphere where good is. Just as soon as it approaches, evil retreats of itself and falls back, for evil is of hell, while good is of heaven. So that's a deep conviction and receptiveness to the Lord that can have a powerful influence, which is what Daniel does throughout the story of his life, or what he depicts. So we might ask for ourselves, what is Daniel in us? What is a part that stands for a principle the Lord teaches, and it's not a matter to us of if we'll obey, it's simply a matter of how. Likely we can't say that of many principles, but likely there are some that we stand for in that absolute way. And this is the part of us that can resist without needing to fight, even in hard times, even when we failed, perhaps when we're filled with shame or with strong desires. This is the part that is open to the Lord, even in the midst of all of that chaos. So the Lord wanted to give these young men food that stands for all these desires. The children of Israel yearned to go back to the flesh pots of Egypt where they had lots of food, and particular meat instead of manna. Similarly, here, Daniel was faced with the choice of food that is bad, and he wanted to avoid it. He wanted to eat only vegetables and water. And this choice stands for the strength of Daniel that we see throughout the story. Jesus said, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." And later, the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. This is the food that Daniel wants. He wants to eat that heavenly food that contrasts with the delight of doing evil. He wants to love doing what the Lord wants. So we have vegetables versus fancy food, water versus wine. And notice here that the conflict is between two different kinds of delight. That overwhelming, strong feeling from hell and the quieter, less outwardly strong, but actually more powerful emotions and desires from heaven. And Daniel proposes a 10-day test. We'll eat our diet, everyone else eat the other diet, see who looks better after 10 days. We could do the same. When we've done what is wrong, how does that feel? After the intense, passionate delight fades, what's left? And when we do what's right, even if it doesn't elate us at the time, what is its lasting effect? Although the number 10 here is given for its symbolic value, we could even decide to choose 10 days dedicated to doing something that we know the Lord would like us to do. See if it leaves us healthier. It might be a greater devotion to a practice like reading the Word or praying. It might be a greater focus on viewing others with compassion or in reining in our pride or our fear. What effect does that have? In the story, Daniel and his friends were tested and found to be 10 times wiser than all the other people. And what that means is that doing things the Lord's way is many times more powerful, incomparably so. Now, this story is just the beginning. We've got 5 more weeks that we're going to be exploring the following 5 chapters in Daniel. And in each of them, this conviction, Daniel's conviction in turning to the Lord for strength and guidance, is the reason he's able to prevail seemingly effortlessly. And he prevails not because of who he is, but because he's allowing the Lord in, and the Lord is the one who prevails. So in closing then, 2 things that we can think about in the coming week. What are your Daniel truths, those non-negotiable, this is who I am ones, that you're going to live regardless of circumstances or opposition? And 2, what is a spiritual truth, a spiritual principle, a spiritual practice that you might consider giving extra attention to applying in the next 10 days, or if you want to, in the next 6 weeks during this series? Hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is mercy, and with him is abundant redemption. Amen.